Hello everyone.
About 70% of the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be very happy if you did.
I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Story 1. Working the night shift at an old, out-of-the-way diner in a small town wasn't something I ever thought would lead to anything unusual. The diner itself had been in business for decades, run by an elderly couple who seemed to know more about the place than they let on. I took the night shifts mainly to keep myself busy while I worked on my writing, but there was something unsettling about the place. The walls, covered in faded wallpaper, seemed to press in on you, and the flickering neon sign outside cast long shadows inside the diner. One night, just after the dinner rush had passed and the diner was mostly empty, I noticed something strange. I was wiping down the counter when I felt a cold draft sweep through the room, even though the door was closed. I didn't think much of it at first, assuming it was just the air conditioning or a draft from the old windows. But then I heard a soft tapping sound coming from the corner booth, the one that was never really used by customers. I glanced over, and for a split second, I could have sworn I saw someone sitting there, their back facing me. The tapping continued in a steady rhythm, almost like they were trying to get my attention. I blinked and the figure vanished, leaving only the empty booth. My heart began to race, and I quickly tried to dismiss it as a trick of the light or my imagination. But that booth had always given me the creeps, and something about that night made it feel different. The days following that incident were quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the diner anymore. I started noticing small things: utensils moved out of place, glasses had condensation on them when no one had ordered a drink, and the temperature fluctuated unnaturally. Every night I'd close the diner, the atmosphere would feel heavier, as if something was waiting for me to leave. I'd often hear the faint sound of footsteps when I was locking the back door, but when I turned around, no one would be there. It wasn't long before I realized I wasn't the only one who felt uneasy. One of the waitresses, a young girl named Kate, confided in me one evening that she'd seen strange things while working late shifts too. She'd been working the late shift for a while and had noticed similar occurrences: flickering lights, cold spots, and objects that seemed to move on their own. The thing that unsettled her the most, though, was the smell. Every once in a while, she'd get a whiff of something foul, like rotten food or something decaying, even though the diner was always kept spotless. Kate told me that she had heard rumors about the diner's past, rumors that the owners never spoke of. The diner had been built in the 1950s, and in the early years, there had been a tragic accident in the kitchen. The previous owner, who had been in charge before the elderly couple, had died in a fire that started in the back storage room. Some said he'd been trapped inside and had perished in the flames, while others claimed that he had deliberately started the fire, driven by some unknown madness. Either way, the fire left a permanent scar on the building, and the people who worked there afterwards swore the place was haunted. One night, I stayed late to finish some paperwork, hoping to get it done before the next shift began. The diner was eerily quiet, the hum of the refrigerators and the clinking of my pen on the paper the only sounds in the empty room. Suddenly, I heard the unmistakable sound of something crashing in the kitchen. I stood up and went to check, my heart pounding in my chest. But when I reached the kitchen, everything was exactly as it had been before: clean, organized, and undisturbed. A sense of dread settled in my stomach as I realized that whatever had caused the sound had to be something else. The longer I worked there, the more I started to feel like I was being watched. The mirrors on the walls, once bright and clear, now seemed clouded, as if something was lingering just out of sight. I began to feel a constant pressure in the back of my mind, a nagging sensation that something was going to happen, that I was being drawn into something far darker than I could comprehend. The worst night came a week later. I was closing up alone when the lights in the diner flickered and went out completely. The silence that followed was suffocating, the kind that made you aware of every breath you took. My phone's flashlight barely cut through the darkness as I tried to find the circuit breaker. Then I heard the soft tapping sound, but this time it wasn't coming from the booth. It was coming from behind me. I turned around, my breath catching in my throat as I saw a shadow move along the far end of the diner. It was tall, too tall to be a trick of the light, and it moved with an unnatural slowness. My legs felt frozen in place as I watched it drift toward the kitchen before vanishing entirely. I didn't wait to find out more. I grabbed my bag and ran out the front door, locking it behind me with shaking hands. After that night, I never went back. I quit my job the next morning over the phone, making up an excuse about moving out of town. The owners didn't ask questions, and I got the feeling they had heard similar excuses before. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined everything, if maybe the exhaustion and the eerie atmosphere had gotten to me. But deep down, I know what I saw, and I know that something unnatural lingers in that diner. Months later, I drove past the place on a whim, just to see if it was still there. The neon sign flickered as it always had, casting those familiar long shadows inside. For a moment, I thought I saw something move in the corner booth, but I didn't stop to look closer. I kept driving, the memory of that last night still fresh in my mind. Whatever is waiting in that diner, I hope it never follows me. Story 2. I had always been skeptical about haunted places until I spent a weekend at an old bed and breakfast in rural Pennsylvania. The building had been standing for over 100 years, and its history was full of strange occurrences. The owners mentioned guests leaving in the middle of the night, but I dismissed it as exaggeration. The idea of an abandoned inn with a dark past intrigued me more than it scared me. The moment I stepped inside, I noticed the musty air and the way my footsteps echoed through the wooden halls. The receptionist, an older woman with tired eyes, handed me a heavy brass key. She told me my room was on the second floor at the end of the hall, the farthest from the staircase. I found it odd that she made a point to mention that, but I didn't ask any questions. The room itself was small, with antique furniture and faded floral wallpaper peeling at the edges. The only window overlooked the backyard, where an old wooden bench sat beneath a gnarled tree. I set my bag down and tested the bed, which creaked under my weight. As I sat there, I became aware of how unnaturally quiet the entire inn was. That night, I woke up to the sound of someone walking in the hallway outside my room. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, pausing every few steps as if the person was listening for something. I glanced at the clock on the nightstand and saw that it was just past 2 a.m. The steps stopped right outside my door, and for a long moment there was complete silence. I held my breath, waiting to hear the sound of a key or the creak of the floorboards moving away. Instead, the doorknob rattled, as if someone was testing if it was locked. My stomach tightened, and I sat up, heart pounding in my chest. The rattling stopped, followed by the faint sound of breathing just beyond the door. I didn't dare move, afraid that whoever was outside would hear me. Minutes passed, and eventually the footsteps retreated down the hall. I waited until I could no longer hear them before getting up and turning on the light. I checked the door, making sure it was locked, then stood there, listening to the silence that had returned to the building. The next morning I asked the receptionist if anyone else was staying on my floor. She shook her head and said I was the only guest in that section of the inn. When I mentioned hearing footsteps, she hesitated before admitting that other guests had reported the same thing. Some even claimed to hear whispers through the walls, though no one had ever seen anything. That evening, I decided to leave my room door slightly open, just enough to see into the hallway. I wanted to prove to myself that it was just the old building settling, that there was nothing unusual happening. I turned off the light and lay in bed, staring at the sliver of darkness visible through the cracked door. The hours passed, and at some point I must have dozed off. I woke up to the sound of footsteps again, slow and measured, just like before. My heart pounded as I turned my head toward the door, my breath catching in my throat. A shadow moved past the opening, tall and deliberate, but completely silent beyond the sound of footsteps. I squeezed my eyes shut, unwilling to see more. When I finally gathered the courage to open my eyes, the hallway was empty. The door, which I had left slightly open, was now wide open. I sat up, feeling an overwhelming sense of unease wash over me. Something wasn't right, and I needed to leave. I packed my bag in a rush, barely bothering to zip it up before grabbing my key and stepping into the hallway. The air felt heavy, and every creak of the wooden floor seemed amplified. As I neared the staircase, I glanced back toward my room and felt a cold chill rush over me. The door was closed again. I practically ran down the stairs, my pulse racing as I reached the front desk. The receptionist looked up, unsurprised by my panicked state. She nodded before I could even say anything and reached under the desk, pulling out a small notepad. She slid it across the counter, and I saw my name written at the top. She told me that nearly every guest who had stayed in that room left early, usually before sunrise. Some refused to speak about their experiences, while others mentioned the same footsteps and strange presence in the hall. She said she had stopped assigning that room unless absolutely necessary. I wanted to ask why, but I already knew the answer. As I stepped outside, the cool night air hit my face, grounding me back to reality. I turned back one last time and saw the window of my room, the curtains drawn closed. I told myself I had imagined everything, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. I never booked another stay in an old inn again. For years, I tried to convince myself that it had been my imagination. I avoided reading about the inn, not wanting to fuel the paranoia that had followed me since that night. But one evening, curiosity got the best of me, and I searched for any mentions of the place online. The first article that appeared made my stomach drop. It detailed the history of the inn, focusing on room 208, the very room I had stayed in. Decades earlier, a man had died in that room under unexplained circumstances. Guests claimed to hear footsteps, whispers, and even see the door open and close on its own. One couple reported waking up to the sensation of someone standing next to their bed, only to find the room empty. I scrolled through the comments, reading accounts from others who had experienced the same chilling events. One person described the rattling doorknob and the slow footsteps in the hallway. Another mentioned seeing a shadow pass by the door, just like I had. The more I read, the harder it became to dismiss my experience as a trick of the mind. Even now, I find myself double-checking my bedroom door before I sleep. Some nights I wake up suddenly, convinced I've heard slow, deliberate footsteps outside my door. I tell myself it's just my imagination, but deep down, I can't shake the feeling that something followed me from that inn. I don't think I'll ever truly be alone again. Story 3. I had never believed in haunted places until I took a job renovating an old house on the outskirts of a small town in Virginia. The house had been abandoned for decades, its windows boarded up, the yard overgrown with weeds. The locals avoided it, calling it cursed, but I chalked that up to superstition. The pay was good, and I had no reason to refuse. The first time I stepped inside, the air was thick with dust, and the scent of decay clung to the walls. The wooden floor creaked under my boots, and my flashlight cast long shadows across the peeling wallpaper. Most of the furniture was gone, but remnants of the past remained: a broken rocking chair, a stained mattress, and a few framed photographs left behind. I felt an odd sense of unease, but I ignored it and got to work. My job was to strip the place down and prepare it for a full renovation. The first few days were uneventful, though the house had an unsettling stillness. The wind outside made the old boards groan, and the occasional rustling of rodents in the walls kept me on edge. At night, I stayed in a small trailer nearby, relieved to leave the house behind when the sun went down. On the fourth day, I was removing the boards from the windows in what had once been the living room. As I pried the last one loose, I caught a glimpse of something in the reflection of the glass. A dark figure stood in the hallway behind me, motionless. My breath caught in my throat as I spun around, but the hall was empty. The air felt colder, but I told myself it was my imagination. That night, as I lay in my trailer, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept thinking about the figure I had seen in the reflection. I wanted to believe it was a trick of the light, but something deep inside told me otherwise. Sleep came slowly, and even then, it was restless. The next morning, I returned to the house early, determined to finish as quickly as possible. As I walked through the front door, I immediately noticed something was off. The tools I had left in the living room were scattered across the floor. Some had been moved to the opposite side of the room, as if someone had been in there during the night. I checked the doors and windows, but they were still locked from the inside. I tried to shake it off and continued working. Around midday, I was in the upstairs hallway, pulling down a section of damaged plaster, when I uncovered a small wooden door. It was built into the wall, no taller than 3 feet, and had been nailed shut. Something about it made my skin crawl, but my curiosity got the better of me. I pried the nails loose and slowly pulled the door open. A narrow crawl space stretched into darkness, the air inside damp and stale. I shone my flashlight inside and saw that the space was lined with old newspapers, their edges curled and yellowed with age. In the center of the crawl space was a small wooden chair. The sight of it made my stomach turn, though I didn't know why. I stepped back, suddenly feeling like I had made a mistake opening that door. That night, the dream started. I saw the house as it once was, filled with people, their faces blurred and indistinct. The air was thick with tension, a sense of something lurking just beyond my vision. I woke up drenched in sweat, the silence of my trailer pressing in around me. The uneasy feeling from the day before had only grown stronger. The next morning, I found the small door in the hallway open again, even though I had shut it before leaving. I told myself I must have forgotten, but the thought didn't sit right with me. As I worked, I felt the sensation of being watched grow stronger. Every time I turned, there was nothing there, but the feeling never left me. That evening, I stayed later than usual, determined to finish removing the damaged flooring. As I worked, I heard a faint sound coming from upstairs. It was a soft creaking, rhythmic, like the slow movement of a rocking chair. My stomach tightened as I realized it was coming from the hallway where I had found the small door. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously made my way up the stairs. The air felt heavier with each step, the creaking sound continuing at an even pace. As I reached the top of the stairs, I saw the small wooden chair inside the crawl space, now facing the doorway. The moment my flashlight beam touched it, the creaking stopped. A sharp chill ran down my spine as I backed away, my heart pounding. I slammed the small door shut and nailed it closed, my hands shaking. I didn't know what was happening in that house, but I no longer wanted to be part of it. I gathered my things and left, determined not to return. That night, I barely slept. My mind replayed the events of the day over and over. The creaking chair, The feeling of being watched, the way my tools had been moved. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, but I knew deep down that something was wrong with that house. The next morning, I called the property owner and told them I couldn't continue the job. I didn't offer an explanation, and they didn't ask for one. As I packed up my trailer, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. Whatever was in that house, I was leaving it behind. Years later, I heard that the renovations had been completed, but the new owners didn't stay long. Rumors spread that they left in the middle of the night, abandoning the house just like those before them. No one knew why, but I had a feeling I did. Some places aren't meant to be lived in. Some doors should stay closed. Story 4. I took a job cleaning out an old motel just outside of town, a place that had been abandoned for over 20 years. The owner, an older man who had inherited the property, wanted to sell the land but needed the building cleared out first. He offered me good money to do the job alone, saying he couldn't find anyone else willing to step foot inside. I didn't understand why at the time, but I should have asked more questions. The first time I walked into the motel, the air was stale, thick with the scent of rotten dust. The front desk was still intact, covered in old receipts and ledgers from the last guests who had stayed there. The key rack behind the counter had several rusted keys still hanging, each one labeled with a room number. I ran my fingers along the counter and noticed something strange. There was still a small bell sitting there, its metal dull with age. I started my work in the main office, clearing out old paperwork and broken furniture. It was tedious, but nothing felt out of the ordinary at first. The floors creaked under my weight, and the wind outside made the loose shutters bang against the walls. The only thing that unsettled me was the silence. It wasn't the normal quiet of an empty building. It felt thicker, like the air itself was holding its breath. After the office, I moved on to the rooms, starting with those nearest the front. Most of them were stripped bare, the beds gone, the wallpaper peeling in long curling strips. Some rooms still had furniture, though it was covered in thick layers of dust and mold. One room had a suitcase left behind, its fabric eaten through by time. I unzipped it out of curiosity and found old clothes, neatly folded, as if someone had expected to return. I kept working late into the evening, wanting to finish as much as I could before heading home. As I moved to the next room, I noticed something odd. The door was slightly ajar, even though I hadn't touched it yet. I pushed it open and stepped inside, shining my flashlight around. The air in this room was colder than the others, and a faint smell of cigarette smoke lingered despite the years of abandonment. On the bedside table, an ashtray sat undisturbed, a single cigarette resting on the edge, as if someone had just put it down. That was impossible. The motel had been abandoned for decades. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I backed out of the room, my pulse quickening. I forced myself to move on, but the unease stuck with me. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in that motel. I told myself it was just my imagination, the effect of working in a place left to decay. Still, as I lay in bed at home, I kept seeing that cigarette in my mind, unburned, waiting. It was enough to keep me awake for hours. The next morning, I returned with a renewed sense of determination. I told myself I wouldn't let a weird feeling get to me. I focused on clearing out the rest of the rooms, moving through them as quickly as possible. Everything was fine until I reached the last room at the end of the hall. The door was locked, and the key was missing from the rack at the front desk. I searched through the pile of keys I had collected but found nothing that matched the number on the door. Frustrated, I decided to leave it for last and continued working. But as I turned away, I heard the faintest sound, something soft, like the rustling of fabric or the shifting of weight on an old mattress. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my ears. The sound had come from inside that locked room. I knocked hesitantly, my voice unsteady as I called out, but there was no answer. The silence stretched too long, pressing in around me. I left the hallway, deciding that whatever was inside I didn't need to know. I spent the rest of the afternoon finishing up, but I couldn't stop glancing back toward that locked door. I knew I had to check inside before I left for good. Before the sun went down, I went back to the front desk and searched through the drawers one last time. Eventually, I found a single, unlabeled key at the back of the lowest drawer. I held it for a long moment before heading back down the hall. The key fit perfectly. The lock clicked open with a soft, reluctant sound, and I slowly pushed the door inward. The air inside was thick and suffocating, as if it hadn't moved in years. My flashlight flickered as I swept it across the room, taking in the sight before me. Unlike the other rooms, this one was untouched. The bed was still made, the blankets smooth, the pillows undisturbed. A suitcase sat in the corner, closed but not dusty like the one I had found earlier. On the nightstand, an old rotary phone rested beside a small notepad, its top page torn away. Then I noticed the closet door. It was slightly open. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped closer, my pulse hammering in my ears. I reached out with a shaking hand and pulled the door open the rest of the way. Inside, hanging from the metal rod, was a single dark suit, its fabric pristine, as if it had been waiting. But the part that sent a chill through me was the shoes. A pair of polished black shoes sat neatly on the floor beneath the suit, pointed toward the bed. It looked as if someone had been standing there, waiting, before simply vanishing. I stepped back, a deep, primal fear settling into my bones. I didn't finish clearing that room. I left the motel without looking back, locking the door behind me. I returned the keys to the owner and told him the job was done, but I never mentioned what I had found. He didn't ask, and I didn't offer. A year later, the motel was torn down. I read about it in the paper, a small article buried in the back pages. No one bought the land after that. It sat empty, growing over with weeds, forgotten by time. I never drove past that place again. Some buildings aren't abandoned. They're left behind, and whatever remains inside them stays waiting. Story 5. I took a job as a night security guard for an old office building on the edge of the city. The building had been mostly abandoned for years, with only one law firm still renting space on the first floor. My job was simple: walk through the halls a few times, make sure no one had broken in, and watch the security cameras until morning. It sounded easy, but after my first night I knew something about the place wasn't right. The first thing I noticed was the elevator. It still worked, even though most of the upper floors were empty. The law firm only used the first floor, and no one ever had a reason to go higher. But every night, the elevator doors would open by themselves. I would be sitting at my desk, watching the monitors, when I'd hear the ding of the elevator arriving on the first floor. I'd check the cameras, but no one would be inside. At first, I assumed it was a mechanical issue. The building was old, and maybe the wiring was faulty. But then I started hearing footsteps in the halls when I knew I was alone. I'd do my rounds, checking each floor, making sure all the doors were locked and everything was in place. But as soon as I returned to my desk, I'd hear its slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the upper floors. The worst was the fourth floor. Unlike the other levels, which were just dusty and empty, the fourth floor still had furniture left behind from the previous tenants. Old desks, broken chairs, and filing cabinets sat in the dimly lit rooms untouched for years. The entire floor smelled of stale air and something else, something faintly metallic. Every time I stepped onto that floor, I felt like I was being watched. One night around 2 a.m., I heard something that made my skin crawl. I was reviewing the camera feeds when I heard a door slam somewhere above me. The sound was loud, echoing through the empty building. I grabbed my flashlight and started up the stairs, my heart pounding with every step. I reached the 4th floor and hesitated before stepping inside. The air felt heavier than usual, thick and unmoving. I walked down the hallway, shining my light into each empty office. Nothing seemed out of place, but then I reached the last room at the end of the hall. The door was wide open, even though I was sure it had been shut before. I stepped inside, scanning the room with my flashlight, but it was empty, just the same old desks and chairs covered in dust. Then, just as I turned to leave, I heard the sound of paper rustling. I swung my flashlight toward the desk in the corner. A single sheet of paper sat on its surface, though I was certain the desk had been empty before. I stepped closer, my breath catching as I read the words written in shaky handwriting. "Who's watching the cameras now, oh?" I felt a wave of cold fear wash over me. My first instinct was to check the security feed, but the only way to do that was to get back downstairs. I didn't want to turn my back on that room, but I forced myself to move, walking as quickly as I could without breaking into a full sprint. I made it to the stairwell, rushing down the steps 2 at a time, and practically fell into my chair at the security desk. The monitors flickered as I scanned the feeds, my hands shaking. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The empty hallways, the silent offices, everything was as it should be. But then, movement on the 4th floor camera caught my eye. The room I had just left, the one with the note, had someone standing inside. It was a man, or at least the shadow of one. The figure stood near the desk, unmoving, its head slightly tilted as if watching me through the camera. My breath hitched as I stared at the screen, unable to look away. Then, without warning, the figure took a slow step forward, out of view of the camera. I bolted from my chair. I don't know what I thought I was going to do. There was no way I was going back up there. I grabbed my phone and dialed the building owner, my fingers trembling. It rang a few times before he answered, his voice groggy with sleep. I told him what had happened, expecting him to dismiss it, but instead there was a long silence. Finally, he sighed and said, "You should leave. Lock up and don't come back." His response stunned me. I asked him what he meant, but he just repeated himself. "Lock up and don't come back." Then he hung up. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my things, locked the front doors, and walked away from that building without looking back. The next day, I did some research. The office building had once belonged to a private investigation firm, but one of the detectives had gone missing inside. No one ever found his body, just his office left exactly as it had been the day he disappeared. The 4th floor had been sealed off for years, but eventually the locks were removed, and people stopped asking questions. I never went back to that job. The owner never called me again, and I never tried to find out more about what had happened there. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed. If I had waited just a little longer watching the cameras, would I have seen that figure move closer? Would it have made its way down to me? I don't want to know, and I never will. Story 6. I took a job renovating an old motel in the outskirts of town. It had been abandoned for nearly 2 decades, left to decay under layers of dust and neglect. The owner had big plans to restore it, but most of the local contractors refused to work there. The few who did warned me to leave before I got too invested, but I shrugged off their stories. The motel sat on a lonely stretch of highway surrounded by dry, empty fields. It was a single-story building with a row of 12 rooms, all of them in varying states of disrepair. The roof sagged in places, the paint had peeled away, and the sign out front barely held on to its last few letters. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mold and old wood, like something had been rotting for years. My first few nights working there were uneventful. I focused on clearing out debris, fixing the plumbing, and patching holes in the walls. I stayed in one of the less damaged rooms while I worked, using a generator for power since the electricity hadn't been fully restored yet. It wasn't comfortable, but I'd done worse jobs. Then, one night, I heard it. A knocking sound. At first I thought it was the wind rattling the old wooden doors, but when I sat up and listened, I realized it was coming from room 6. I knew I was the only one there, and none of the doors should have been unlocked. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the cool night air. Room 6 was one of the worst off. Half of its ceiling had caved in, and the floor was warped from water damage. The door was still locked, just as I had left it. But as I stood there, the knocking came again, louder this time. A slow, deliberate rhythm, as if someone was waiting for me to answer. I hesitated before unlocking the door. The air inside was heavy with dampness, and the walls were covered in deep scratches, as if someone had raked their nails across them in desperation. I stepped inside, scanning the empty room with my flashlight, but nothing seemed out of place. Then, just as I turned to leave, I noticed something strange. A single chair sat in the corner, facing the door. It hadn't been there before I was sure of it. I walked over to inspect it, but the moment my hand brushed the wooden backrest, I heard the sound of footsteps outside. I rushed back to the doorway, shining my light into the darkness, but the lot was empty. The wind whistled through the cracks in the walls, but nothing moved. The next morning, I tried to shake off the feeling of unease. I told myself it was just my imagination, the product of working alone in an abandoned building for too long. But as I continued my work, I found more unsettling things. Old newspapers stacked neatly in one of the rooms, all dated from 1987. A half-eaten meal left untouched in room 9, as if someone had just walked away from it. And then there were the voices. It started faint, like a whisper drifting through the hall. I would be working, hammering away at a broken wall, when I'd hear it someone speaking just beyond my line of sight. The first time I thought it was a passing car radio. But there were no cars, no people, just me and the empty motel. One night, as I was finishing up some repairs in the front office, the sound of a door slamming echoed through the building. I jumped, nearly dropping my tools. I grabbed my flashlight and hurried out, following the noise. The hallway was silent, but one door was open, room 12, the last room at the far end. I had checked that room earlier, making sure it was locked. Now the door stood open, revealing darkness inside. My flashlight flickered as I stepped closer, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I hesitated, then stepped over the threshold. The air inside was freezing, colder than any other part of the motel, and then I saw it. On the wall opposite the bed, words had been scratched into the paint, "Don't stay." The letters were jagged and uneven, as if carved with something sharp. My breath hitched as I reached out, running my fingers over the indentations. The paint flaked away beneath my touch, revealing older scratches underneath layer upon layer of the same warning, written over and over. I left that night. I locked up my tools, packed my things, and drove to the nearest motel in town. I told myself I was just tired, that the isolation was messing with my head. But deep down, I knew something was wrong with that place. The next day, I returned with every intention of quitting. I planned to tell the owner I wouldn't continue the job, that the place was beyond saving. But when I pulled into the lot, something stopped me. The door to room 6, the room where I had first heard the knocking, was wide open. I hadn't left it like that. I was sure I had locked it. My chest tightened as I stepped out of my truck, my keys clutched in my hand. I walked slowly toward the open door, feeling the weight of something unseen pressing down on me. When I reached the doorway, I stopped cold. The chair was gone. The room was empty, just as it had been when I first arrived. But the floor was different. A thick layer of dust covered everything, except for a single set of footprints leading from the doorway to the center of the room. They stopped abruptly, as if whoever had made them had simply vanished. That was enough for me. I turned around, walked straight to my truck, and left without looking back. I called the owner later that day and told him I wouldn't be returning. He didn't seem surprised. He just sighed and said, "You lasted longer than most." I never found out what happened in that motel, and I don't want to know. But sometimes when I drive past that stretch of highway, I glance at the abandoned building, and I swear I see a shadow standing in the doorway, watching, waiting. Story 7. I used to work as a security guard for an old hospital that had been shut down for years. The building was massive, with 6 floors and a basement, all left to decay after funding had run out. My job was simple: walk the halls, check for squatters, and make sure no one broke in. The pay was decent, and I didn't mind the solitude, but from the moment I stepped inside, I knew something felt off. The air was thick with the smell of old disinfectant and dust, and the floors creaked under my boots no matter how lightly I stepped. During the day, the place looked like any other abandoned building: peeling paint, broken ceiling tiles, and graffiti covering the walls. But at night, when the power was off and the only light came from my flashlight, the place felt different. It was as if something unseen was watching, waiting for me to notice. The first few weeks were uneventful. I made my rounds, checking each floor and shining my light into darkened rooms. The silence was unsettling, broken only by the occasional drip of water or the scurrying of rats in the walls. I always felt like I wasn't alone, but I chalked it up to nerves. That changed one night when I heard footsteps coming from the second floor. It was around 2 a.m, and I had just finished checking the basement. As I started up the stairwell, I heard the distinct sound of shoes against tile, slow and deliberate. I stopped, holding my breath, listening. The steps continued for a few seconds, then stopped as if whoever was walking had realized I was there. I called out, announcing myself as security, but there was no response. My first thought was that a trespasser had found a way in, so I tightened my grip on my flashlight and moved toward the hallway. The dim beam of light barely cut through the darkness, illuminating only a few feet ahead. I swept it across the open doorways, looking for any sign of movement. Then, at the end of the hall, I saw it. A door slowly swinging shut. My stomach dropped. That door had been wide open during my last check. I walked toward it cautiously, my footsteps echoing against the empty walls. When I reached it, I pushed it open and shined my light inside. The room was empty, just an old patient room with a broken bed and an overturned chair. But something felt wrong. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there only moments before. I checked every corner, even inside the small bathroom, but there was no one. I turned to leave, and that's when I heard it breathing. It was faint, almost a whisper, but it was unmistakable. A slow, ragged inhale, followed by a strained exhale. My body went rigid, my pulse hammering in my ears. I swung my flashlight around, expecting to see someone standing behind me, but the room was empty. The breathing continued, growing closer, yet there was no source. I bolted. I didn't stop until I reached the first floor, my chest heaving from adrenaline. I forced myself to regain control, reminding myself that fear could make the mind play tricks. but deep down I knew what I had heard was real. After that night, things only got worse. I started hearing doors slam in the distance, always too far for me to reach in time. I'd find chairs moved in hallways I hadn't been through yet, and I'd hear faint whispers echoing through the stairwell. Once, while checking the 3rd floor, I caught a glimpse of something in my peripheral vision, a dark figure standing just inside a doorway. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. One night, as I was doing my rounds on the 4th floor, my radio crackled to life with static. I hadn't touched it, and there was no one else working that shift. The static lasted for a few seconds before cutting out. Then a single word came through, clear as day: leave. My blood ran cold. The voice was low, almost distorted, and it sent a chill through my entire body. I grabbed the radio, trying to respond, but there was nothing but silence. I told myself it was interference, maybe a rogue signal from another frequency, but I knew better. Something didn't want me there. I considered quitting after that, but I needed the job, so I stayed, ignoring the unease that grew stronger with each shift. Then, one night, I made a mistake. I went into the basement alone. The basement had always unsettled me. It was where the hospital stored old equipment, broken stretchers, and rusted wheelchairs, all left to gather dust. But there was something else down there, something I could feel watching me from the moment I stepped inside. As I walked past rows of decaying furniture, I heard a noise behind me. A faint scraping sound, like metal dragging against concrete. I turned, shining my light, but the hallway was empty. My pulse quickened as I took a step forward. The sound came again, closer this time. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A wheelchair, sitting against the far wall, rolled forward an inch. My breath caught in my throat. I stood frozen, my mind racing for a logical explanation. There was no draft, no slope in the floor, nothing that could have caused it to move on its own. I took a step back, my flashlight trembling in my grip. Then, without warning, the wheelchair shot across the room, crashing against the far wall with a deafening clang. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran, sprinting up the stairs 2 at a time. When I reached the main floor, I locked myself in the security office, my hands shaking as I tried to catch my breath. I sat there until my shift ended, refusing to step foot outside until daylight. That was my last night working at the hospital. I quit the next morning, making up an excuse about personal reasons. The supervisor didn't argue, he just nodded, as if he had expected it. As I walked out for the last time, I glanced back at the hospital, half expecting to see something staring at me from one of the broken windows. I never went back, but sometimes I dream about that place. In my dreams, I'm walking through the halls, my flashlight flickering as unseen eyes watch from the darkness. And no matter how hard I try, I can never find my way out. Story 8. I took a temporary job restoring an old Victorian mansion that had been abandoned for decades. The property was massive, surrounded by overgrown trees and a rusted iron gate that barely held together. The house itself was in a state of disrepair, peeling wallpaper, rotting wood, and a heavy layer of dust covering every surface. My job was simple: clean out debris, make notes of structural damage, and help prepare it for renovation. The first day went by without anything strange happening. I worked mostly on the first floor, sweeping broken glass and clearing out old furniture. The mansion was eerily quiet, except for the occasional groan of shifting wood. Even in broad daylight, the place felt unsettling, like I wasn't supposed to be there. By the second day, I had to start checking the upper floors. The grand staircase was lined with portraits of the original owners, their faded eyes watching as I made my way up. Some of the rooms had furniture still intact, covered in thick white sheets. Others were stripped bare, exposing the skeletal remains of the house. While clearing out a bedroom, I found a small wooden rocking chair near the window. It was old but looked sturdy, and something about it unsettled me. I moved it to the hallway, planning to take it downstairs, but when I turned back to the room, the chair was back where I'd found it. I frowned, trying to remember if I had actually moved it. I grabbed it again, this time placing it in the center of the room before stepping out. When I turned back, the chair was rocking, slowly back and forth. I left the room immediately, my heart pounding as I forced myself to keep working. I convinced myself that I had imagined it, that the house settling had caused the movement, but deep down I knew better. As the days went on, the unease grew worse. Doors I had propped open would be shut when I returned. My tools would disappear, only to be found in different rooms. I started hearing noises, faint shuffling sounds like someone walking barefoot on the wooden floors. Once, while in the dining room, I heard the distinct sound of whispering, though I was completely alone. On the fourth day, I was working late, trying to finish clearing the second floor. I had just placed my flashlight on a dresser when I heard a soft knock from inside the closet. I froze, my body tense as I stared at the door. The knock came again, followed by a slow creak as the door opened an inch. I backed away, my breath caught in my throat. I told myself it was just the old hinges shifting, but then something moved. A shadow, small and low to the ground, slipped from the closet into the dark corner of the room. I ran out of there so fast I nearly tripped down the stairs. I refused to go back upstairs that night, finishing my work in the front parlor instead. The entire time I felt like I was being watched. The next morning, I told my supervisor that I didn't want to work alone anymore. He gave me a strange look but agreed to have another worker join me. That day, an older man named Greg came along. He had been with the company for years and had worked on dozens of restorations. We spent the day working on the upper floors together, and for a while, everything seemed fine. But in the late afternoon, Greg suddenly stopped in the middle of the hallway, his face going pale. I asked him what was wrong, but he just shook his head. "I thought I saw something," he muttered. I pressed him for details, but he refused to say more. He worked faster after that, moving as if he wanted to get out of there as soon as possible. That night, I stayed later than usual to finish my checklist. I kept my music on to drown out the silence, but even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was nearby. I was working in the library when I heard footsteps coming from upstairs. Slow, deliberate. I turned off my music and listened. The steps continued, moving across the ceiling above me. I grabbed my flashlight and crept toward the staircase. My hands felt clammy, my heart pounding against my ribs. The house was supposed to be empty. No one else was scheduled to work that late. But as I climbed the stairs, the footsteps stopped. I reached the second floor and swept my flashlight down the hallway. The air felt heavy, thick with something unseen. Then I heard breathing. Not my own, something else. It was coming from the far end of the hall, near the room with the rocking chair. I stepped forward, my pulse hammering in my ears. The door to the room was ajar. I pushed it open slowly, my flashlight trembling. The chair was moving again, rocking back and forth with a slow, steady rhythm. But there was no wind, no draft, nothing that could have caused it. I was about to turn and leave when I heard something behind me. A soft shuffle like bare feet against wood. I spun around, shining my light down the hallway. For a brief moment I saw it. A figure small and hunched, standing at the far end of the hall. Its features were obscured by darkness, but I could see its outline. the way it seemed to shift and blend with the shadows. Then, in an instant, it was gone. I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my car keys. I didn't care about finishing my shift. I didn't care about the job. I just needed to get away. The next day, I called in sick. I wasn't going back. But curiosity got the better of me, and I started researching the history of the house. What I found made my blood run cold. The mansion had once belonged to a wealthy family in the early 1900s. They had a young daughter who was often sick and rarely left her room. One winter, she disappeared without a trace. The family claimed she had wandered off into the woods and gotten lost, but rumors spread that she had died inside the house and that her parents had hidden the truth. Years later, when new owners moved in, strange things began happening. Furniture would be moved, whispers heard in the hallways, and a small shadowy figure seen in the upstairs rooms. Several families left the house in fear before it was abandoned completely. I never went back, but sometimes I still dream about that place. In my dreams, I'm standing in the upstairs hallway, listening to the sound of a rocking chair moving in the darkness. And somewhere, just beyond the edge of my vision, something is watching, waiting. Story 9. I moved into an old boarding house in New Orleans, lured by its affordable rent and historic charm. The building had once been a grand residence in the early 1900s, but had since been divided into small apartments. The landlord mentioned its age, warning me about creaky floors and occasional plumbing issues, but nothing about what I would soon experience. I wasn't superstitious, so I didn't think twice about the house's past. My first night there, I noticed how unsettlingly quiet it was. The thick walls muted the sounds of the outside world, making every small noise within the apartment more pronounced. As I lay in bed, I heard soft tapping against the wall near my headboard. I assumed it was the pipes or an issue with the old wood settling. A few nights later, I was working late when I heard shuffling footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment. I thought it was one of my neighbors, but when I checked through the peephole, the hallway was empty. The building had security doors that locked automatically, and my neighbor was out of town, so I brushed it off as my mind playing tricks on me. One evening, I fell asleep on the couch while reading. I woke up suddenly to the distinct sound of someone whispering my name. It was soft but clear, coming from just a few feet away. My apartment was small, and I knew no one else was inside. My stomach tightened as I scanned the room, but everything was as I left it. Strange things started happening more frequently. My keys would disappear, only to turn up in odd places, like inside my refrigerator or under my bed. My closet door, which I always kept shut, would sometimes be slightly open when I came home. One night, I locked my bedroom door before going to bed, but when I woke up, it was wide open. Determined to find an explanation, I spoke to the landlord about the building's history. He seemed hesitant to share details, but admitted that tenants rarely stayed long. People complain about noises, he said, but it's an old house. When I pressed further, he sighed and told me about a woman who had lived there decades ago. She had been a nurse in the 1940s, living alone after her fiancé was killed in the war. Neighbors described her as kind but deeply sad, often seen standing at her window at night. One winter, she stopped leaving her apartment altogether. A mailman noticed her letters piling up and reported it to the landlord. When they entered her apartment, they found her sitting in a chair by the window, lifeless. Hearing this unsettled me, but I convinced myself it was just an eerie story. That changed when I saw something with my own eyes. One night, I woke up to the sound of my bedroom door creaking open. I sat up, heart pounding, and saw a shadow in the doorway. It wasn't a trick of the light. I could make out the shape of a woman standing there, motionless. I reached for my phone, but the screen wouldn't turn on. When I looked back at the doorway, the figure was gone. My breathing was ragged as I jumped out of bed and turned on every light in the apartment. I barely slept that night, and in the morning, I noticed something chilling on the dusty wooden floor near my bed were faint footprints. From that point on, I felt an unshakable presence in my apartment. It was as if I was never truly alone. Some nights I'd wake up with an overwhelming sense of sadness that wasn't my own. I started keeping a notebook by my bed to jot down anything unusual. One night, as I was writing, my pen suddenly slid across the table on its own. I stared at it, my body frozen with fear. I confided in a friend who was familiar with paranormal activity. She suggested I try speaking to whatever was in my apartment. I thought it was ridiculous, but out of desperation I gave it a try. One evening I sat on my couch and said, "I don't know who you are, but I know you're here. If you need something, let me know." The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, just as I was about to give up, a single knock sounded from the closet door. I felt a chill run through me, but I didn't move. A few minutes later, another knock. That night, I dreamed of a woman sitting by my window, looking out into the street with vacant eyes. The final straw came a week later. I had just returned from work when I found my apartment in complete disarray. Drawers were pulled open, papers were scattered across the floor, and my chair was turned to face the window. The air felt heavy, thick with something unseen. I backed out of the apartment and spent the night at a friend's place. I decided to break my lease and move out. On my last night there, I sat in the empty living room, waiting for a moving truck. I felt a presence behind me and turned, half expecting to see her. Instead, I saw my reflection in the darkened window only. Just behind me there was the faint outline of a woman's face. I rushed out without looking back. I never told the landlord what I saw, knowing he'd only shrug it off. After moving out, I learned from another former tenant that they had experienced the same eerie events. I don't know if she was trying to communicate or if she was simply stuck in a place that held too much pain. All I know is that whatever was in that apartment never truly left. Story 10. The old mansion on the outskirts of town had always been a place of whispered rumors. It stood alone, surrounded by dead trees in an overgrown yard, its windows dark and empty. For years, no one had lived there, and those who dared to approach spoke of an uneasy feeling, like something unseen was watching. When I was 21, I was hired by the new owner to clean it out before renovations began. I arrived early in the morning, the sun hidden behind thick clouds that made the air feel colder than it should have. The front door was heavy, its brass handle worn from years of use, and when I pushed it open, the hinges groaned loudly. Inside, the air was thick with dust and something stale and suffocating. The grand staircase loomed ahead, its wooden steps covered in a layer of grime, leading up into darkness. The first floor was in shambles. Furniture lay scattered, broken and forgotten, while the walls bore deep scratches, as if someone had dragged something sharp across them. The kitchen was worse, the cabinets hanging open, their contents long gone except for rusted silverware and a single plate left on the counter. The floor was covered in dirt, and as I stepped forward, something crunched beneath my boot. I knelt and picked up a small shard of glass. Looking around, I saw more pieces scattered as if a mirror had been shattered. There was no sign of the frame or the rest of it, just those tiny, jagged remains. A sudden chill crept up my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had already overstayed my welcome. I told myself I was being paranoid and continued working. Hours passed, and the sun outside barely made a difference in the gloom that filled the house. I worked in silence, bagging debris and sweeping dust into piles, but every now and then I would hear something. A faint creak upstairs, a soft rustling in the hallway behind me. Each time I would stop and listen, my pulse quickening, but nothing followed. By early evening I was exhausted, my back aching from lifting furniture and clearing debris. I decided to take a break in the dining room, where an old wooden table still stood, untouched by time. I sat down, rubbing my hands together to warm them, when I heard a slow, deliberate knock coming from upstairs. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct, like knuckles tapping against wood. I held my breath, waiting for it to stop. The house was old, settling in the wind, I told myself. But then it came again. 3 knocks, steady, measured, as if someone was trying to get my attention. I stood up, my hands unsteady as I grabbed the flashlight from my bag. I had to check. The staircase creaked with each step, the wood shifting beneath my weight. At the top, a hallway stretched in both directions, doors lining the walls, some slightly ajar. I shined the flashlight around. The beam cutting through the dust filled air. The knocking had come from the farthest room on the left, the one with the door slightly open. My heart pounded as I reached for the handle. The wood was cold beneath my fingers. Slowly I pushed it open, the hinges whining as the door swung inward. The room was empty. Nothing but an old bed frame pushed against the far wall, its mattress rotting away. The window was shut, dust coating the glass so thickly that barely any light seeped through. I stepped inside, my boots stirring up small clouds of dust. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of mildew and age. I turned to leave, but then I saw it. Faint, almost unnoticeable, but their footprints in the dust leading to the closet. My stomach tightened as I realized that the prints weren't mine. Someone had walked in here recently. I hesitated, every part of me screaming to leave, but something compelled me forward. I reached for the closet door, my fingers trembling as I pulled it open. The space inside was small, empty except for an old coat hanging limply from a rusted hook. But the footprints ended here. Whoever had made them hadn't walked out. A cold wave of dread washed over me. I stepped back quickly, nearly tripping over myself as I turned toward the hallway. The moment I did, the closet door slammed shut behind me with a force that sent dust swirling into the air. I bolted, my pulse thundering in my ears, nearly stumbling down the stairs in my hurry. Back on the first floor, I grabbed my things, my hands shaking as I shoved everything into my bag. I needed to get out. As I turned to leave, I caught something in the corner of my eye. In the reflection of an old mirror near the entrance, I saw a figure standing at the top of the stairs. It was barely visible in the dim light, just a dark outline unmoving. I didn't wait. I yanked the door open and stepped outside, gasping as the fresh air hit my lungs. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I was at my car, the house looming behind me like a silent predator. My hands were unsteady as I fumbled with the keys, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that dark figure standing at the top of the stairs, watching me. The next day, I called the owner and told him I wouldn't be coming back. He didn't ask why. Maybe he already knew. A few weeks later, I heard that the renovations had been delayed. The workers refused to stay after dark, complaining of strange noises and the feeling of being watched. Eventually, the owner gave up and put the house back on the market. No one bought it. It still stands there, empty, waiting for the next person foolish enough to step inside. To this day, I don't know what I encountered in that house. I tell myself it was just an old building, filled with nothing but shadows and dust. But deep down, I know better. That place wasn't empty, and whatever was inside never wanted me to leave. Story 11. I took a job at a historic hotel that had been shut down for years and was now undergoing renovations. The building was massive, a 5-story structure with grand architecture that had been left to decay. My job was simple: assist with cleaning out old furniture, removing debris, and documenting structural issues. It sounded easy enough, and I wasn't superstitious like some of the older workers who refused to work past sundown. The first few days were uneventful, though the building had an eerie atmosphere. The hallways were long and dimly lit by temporary work lamps, casting shadows on the peeling wallpaper. Many of the rooms had furniture still intact, as if the guests had simply vanished. The air was thick with dust, and the silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional creak of old wood settling. I spent most of my time on the second floor, hauling out broken chairs and dusty rugs. One afternoon, while clearing out a suite, I found an old guest ledger sitting on a desk. Flipping through it, I saw names and dates from decades ago, the ink faded but still legible. Some pages had been torn out, and certain names had been violently scratched out, leaving deep grooves in the paper. That same